Hello and welcome to this extra special end of year episode of the Spiked podcast. I'm Fraser Myers, delighted to welcome as ever Spike's editor Tom Slater.
Hello, Merry Christmas.
And two extra special guests, two for the price of one. We've got the brilliant Spike columnist Inaya, Folarin, Iman.
Hello, thank you for having me.
And from Trigonometry, Francis Foster.
Hey.
Welcome back. Thank you so much for being on the show. We have an action-packed show for you today. So much to cover. The year of crazy elections. We've got the year the culture war went mad, and then maybe there were some victories as well. We'll be talking about the unravelling of the Middle East and even the riots in England and so much more. But before we get on to that, I just want to quickly remind everyone that all viewers and listeners to this podcast can get 20% off Beckett's Gin. So if you're looking for a last minute Christmas present, go to beckettsgin.co.uk/spiked to get a 20% discount. And Tom, do you want to update us on the Christmas Give-a-thon?
Thank you so much to everyone who has donated so far to the Christmas appeal. As happens every year, we're overwhelmed by the response. And as we keep pointing out, it's because of people who watch this show, who read Spiked every week, and then who reach into their pockets and donate, that we're able to do what we do. You know, contrary to George Monbiot's conspiracy theories, we're not the mouthpiece of billionaires. It's actually our readers and our viewers and our listeners who fund us. I want to say a particular thank you to a couple of people who've been very generous in the past week or so. Clive, thank you. Steve, Ben, Ellie, Penelope, Samantha, Mark and Glennis, first names only because perhaps they don't want to be identified. And I want to also remind people that there is still time to donate to the Christmas appeal, and we are still giving away these lovely Spiked mugs to anyone who donates £50 or more over the festive period. So if you haven't given already and you'd like to, please do go to spiked-online.com/donate.
Do you know, I half expect you to read out Penelope, Clive, Elon.
Well, if you're watching,
Yeah.
we're in the market for $100 million as well.
Exactly.
So 2024 was the year of elections, actually the most elections in history in any one particular year. And it contained its fair share of upsets, probably most notably the election of Donald Trump. But also looking back, there was many upsets in France, the European elections, populists are on the march. Tom, what has been your sort of take on this, extraordinary year?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because this began as the year of elections, and already back in January that was being talked about with a certain sense of foreboding. We've got all these elections. What are these terrible people going to do? And what we have seen is one blow landed against the establishment over and over again, certainly across the West. It's not a uniform picture, of course, but if you take kind of Donald Trump's quite striking victory in the US as the kind of capstone, you go back in the year and you look at, as you say, the European elections. In France, in Germany, in Italy, you had populists to right-wing, in some cases, hard right parties coming either first or second, which is really quite striking. You've also seen, of course, in our own election, the rise of the Reform Party, a movement that had really been written off, but really helped deal the decisive blow to the Conservatives, carve out 14% of the vote, and still very much kind of threatening to continue to make their presence felt in British politics. And of course, we've also seen more domestically since those European elections, the French government teetering on the brink of collapse. You've got the German government, which has already collapsed under pressure from voters who are increasingly restive and opting for populist parties. So that is so abundantly clear that whilst there have been various points in which the populist revolt gets written off as a blip or as it's over, COVID killed it, this event killed it, the war in Ukraine killed it, it keeps coming back because those issues that people are concerned about aren't going away. And if anything, the establishment has made their lives worse in so many different respects. I suppose the other striking thing, quickly, I'd say, is that in many situations, the response from the existing establishment has become quite more explicitly vengeful and authoritarian. I mean, the most extreme, I suppose, you could point to the recent annulment of the first round of the presidential election in Romania. But even in the wake of the rise of the AfD in Germany, open discussions this year about whether or not this political party should just be banned outright. The German security services actually explicitly labelling it an extremist group. And whilst in America, I think it's fair to say there is kind of more in sadness than in anger that people have taken the result this time around. I don't think that will necessarily remain the case for that long, particularly once the Trump government comes in. So it's been a really striking picture. But again, the kind of revolt of the of ordinary people continues, but the vengeance and the anger of the establishment continues to be a feature and seems to be becoming more extreme in some circumstances as well.
Definitely. Inaya, do you think this year we've had a clearer sense of what people are revolting against, the kind of policies they don't like, the kind of attitude from the elites they don't like?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. I mean, many of the kind of realignment as it's been termed over the last few years, the concerns that were raised, for example, in the 2016 election of Donald Trump and the Brexit vote. In many ways, those issues are still there. This idea that many of the cultural and political establishment are disconnected from the concerns and the interests of the majority, if not actively disdaining of many of their views. And, we were just talking about reform. I think, yes, they're a challenge to the Conservative Party, but actually they're second in 89 Labour seats. So we can see that these questions of kind of economic decline, migration, national identity, patriotism is something that crosses that kind of left-right dynamic that is still very pertinent. And yes, in the US as well. I mean, as Tom said, many people essentially thought that 2016 was a fluke and that 2020 was everything back in order. We had a flurry of articles, populism is dead, not realizing that the forces and the political dynamics still shaping, many democracies were still there. And actually, it is fascinating that so many democratic elites and others thought that you could potentially, again, try and get Trump off the ballot as well, by flooding him with attempts to convict him. Some of those things were just frankly spurious. The impeachment multiple times. And they thought that if you just did this would get rid of the support for him. But in many ways, that actually revived Trumpism. Like, there was a point where many people thought, actually, maybe this might be over. People were looking at DeSantis and other people. But the intensity to which the establishment attempted to remove Donald Trump actually almost recreated him once again.
Definitely. And Francis, I mean, we've talked a bit about the rise of reform in the UK, but, we shouldn't forget the general election was a big victory for Keir Starmer. Do you think maybe, perhaps, is that the last gasp of that kind of managerial, technocratic, sort of woke type of politics? Is Starmer, will something hopefully more exciting replace him?
I think I tend to see the election of Starmer not really as an election for Labour, but as a total and utter rejection of the Conservative Party. They had 14 years in power in which they were less than useless. In fact, they were so bad, it actually looked like they were doing it on purpose. It reminded me of, when a girl is going out with someone, a boy, whatever it may be, and they're being a terrible partner so that they get broken up with because they don't have the balls to do it themselves. I think that's where Rishi Sunak was at the end of it. He was like, I just want a holiday, so let's just call an early election, because he just wanted to get it over and done with. If you look at both sides of both parties, they're not fit for purpose, either one of them. And what you have now is Reform, who are ready and waiting to take their place. But what's interesting about Reform is, if you look at Nigel Farage's career through politics, he's always been the disruptor. He's always been the one disrupting the equilibrium, the one who has just been the catalyst for change. Can he be that politician that appeals to both sides, holds the centre ground together and takes us somewhere better as a country? Personally, I hope so, because I'm looking at both of the options we've got now, and none of them are any good, to be quite frank.
Yeah, because, Tom, there's often, when we're talking about, populist parties, and this is particularly the case in Europe, where you have certainly much harder right parties, there can often be a ceiling on the support of these parties, whether that's because of their iffy pasts or they might have dodgy candidates. To a certain extent, that might have hurt Reform in this general election, but where do you see that going? I mean, can the populist movement broaden its base a bit beyond that?
In a sense, I think that's one of the stories of this year, which is that populism was very much kind of written off as something that is kind of old, embittered white men in post-industrial parts of the country. And yet, if you take somewhere like Germany, for instance, you suddenly had a lot of younger voters who were attracted to the populist parties. Simultaneously, you had the rise of the Sarah Wagenknecht alliance, which is this left conservative, a former left party leader who has recognised that immigration is a problem, who's also speaking to people's concerns about gender and wokeness and so on. And whilst that was originally presented, this is going to eat into the much more extreme kind of AfD vote, that didn't happen. So therefore, the kind of populist coalition is kind of broadening. So one thing I've been struck by, because you're absolutely right, there are a lot of parties which are benefiting from this populist moment who are quite genuinely unsavoury, have some genuinely unsavoury individuals in it. The AfD is a good example. Their lead candidate in Thuringia, Bjorn Höcke, a man who's been who's actually been convicted for repeating Nazi slogans. Is the most charitable thing you could say about him is that he's a troll, if not something more sinister than that. But I think what we've had up until this point is that voters were deprived of any alternatives. All the parties were singing from the same hymn sheet. And what's been striking is people are more willing to kind of hold their nose and vote for these parties than previously. But I think you're right. I think in many situations that has been a potential kind of drag anchor on them because of the fact that they might be the only ones up until this point who have been willing to sully themselves by dealing with these issues. But there are still obviously a substantial portion of the electorate who don't want to go there because of their past or even because of their present and some of the things that some of their candidates tend to say. But there's clearly plenty more that's there for the taking. It's just that across Europe and in many other countries, this space has been dominated by more right-wing to hard-right factions because they were the only ones willing to touch a lot of these issues, regrettably.
Yeah, definitely. Francis, want to jump in?
No, I was just saying, like, who would have thought that German nationalists might not be the good guys? It's almost like they got a history for that kind of thing, isn't it?
So, one of the things that people are clearly upset about, you see this in a lot of polling, is, I guess, you could broadly call it woke. The trans issue came up a lot in the US election, perhaps more than people expected. Do people have a sense that this year might be the one where things have really started to change? Because we haven't just had the election of Donald Trump, but also, something like the Cass Review that seems to have really shone a light on the dangers of trans ideology. It's become almost socially acceptable to say that this is a bad thing. Francis, even on your podcast recently, we had, the great Stephen Fry saying he doesn't support this stuff. Inaya, what have you made of that? Is there something shifting here?
I do think something has shifted. I mean, I watched a segment with Coleman Hughes and a few trans activists on CNN, and Coleman had brought up the Cass Review, and for once, the trans activists were listening. Like when they were presented with something that was authoritative, evidence-based, it was very hard for them to really say much. I mean, some people would still do it anyway, but I just thought that the Cass Review gave something authoritative. Hilary Cass herself, it's very hard to discredit her, although some people have tried to, but she's worked in this field for decades. She's a very respected person. I mean, in a way, it is a shame that it had to get to that point where, something for most people, I would say, is quite obvious that we should be extremely cautious giving children these kinds of drugs. But sadly, in the situation that we're in, that was needed. But also, you mentioned, Donald Trump. I mean, in his campaign, he literally said that, Kamala is for they, them, and we are for you. I mean, this is really going quite hard on this gender ideology.
They spent most money on that, on those ads in the final weeks. That was where they poured their resources in. So obviously,
exactly, and it was extremely effective. It really did cut through. And so now, not only in 2016 when he didn't get the popular vote, he actually got the popular vote now. I think that shows that something really has shifted.
And Tom, I mean, for a long time, people would try and say these issues don't matter. The culture war is just, silly people on the internet. Clearly, that idea can now be put to bed.
No, absolutely. I mean, of course, the electoral upsets we've seen in recent years can't be boiled down just to the culture war. There's obviously a lot of other concerns. The cost of living has been significant recently. Also, just a general sense that politics didn't really reflect their values, reflect their wishes, wasn't responsive to actually their concerns and the things that they wanted to happen in their respective countries. But it's a kind of through line, these cultural issues, isn't it? I mean, and also I think it's something that maps quite neatly onto the kind of class base of these electoral revolts, because it's in many respects this kind of elite identity politics is something that both implicitly and explicitly defines itself against the values of ordinary people. And what we're seeing is a rejection of that kind of woke ideology, something which is cutting across racial lines in the American electorate, but certainly it's something which unifies the kind of multiracial working class because they certainly have a kind of, as well as having kind of similar economic interests, they've also got a similar cultural outlook. And that's something which was very well exploited by the Trump campaign.
Definitely. And sticking with race, actually, it's worth pointing out, I think this has been less commented on, but in a way, 2024 might have been a defeat for BLM. We started the year with the toppling of Claudine Gay, the president of Harvard, who, partly for plagiarism, but partly because she was allowing almost like woke Hamas support run amok in her university, and she was essentially exposed as a DEI hire. We've ended the year with Daniel Penny being exonerated. in 2020, it's not hard to see how his essentially leading to the death of a black man would have been turned quite easily into a BLM story, would have led to riots, huge protests, would have led to him being imprisoned. Have you noticed a shift on the race question, Francis?
Well, I'm glad you asked me, mate.
Because, you are a person of colour from Latin America. You're a Latinx.
I am
token.
Latinx, that is true. Well, actually, what I found very interesting is the paternalistic way the Democrats actually talk about Latin American people and saying, oh, you should vote for us. Now, if you know anything about Cuba or Venezuela, there is no way in hell any of those people are going to vote Democrat. They're just not, number one. Number two, it's really patronizing to think that just simply because you come from a certain culture or you have a certain level of melanin in your skin, you're immediately going to defer to voting for one particular party or another. And another thing that I found actually horrifically amusing was when, I can't remember the exact stat, black men voted for Trump, and then people in the Democrat Party came out and were saying that there's a problem with white supremacy in amongst black and Latino voters.
Yeah.
And at which point is it going to be
Yeah.
that is everyone are you a white supremacist?
Yeah, no, clearly. But I mean, even just on that point, I mean, when I think the Democrats were noticing that there was a shift taking place amongst black men, we can't forget that, Kamala Harris tried to appeal to black men by, encouraging them to sell marijuana, essentially. Yeah. And you had, Barack Obama, trying to be this kind of down with the kids guy.
He said the brothers were letting the side down.
Exactly. I mean, and, this is really treating people like in such an insulting way. And I think that a lot of, ethnic minorities clearly saw through that. But on top of that, I mean, even though, this happened at the end of last year, I think October 7th also really challenged identity politics. I mean, the Chicago, I think, chapter of Black Lives Matter, soon after October 7th, put out paragliders in celebration. I think many people just saw that this is really, the terrifying conclusion of this kind of hierarchy of identity, racial politics, and where that can really get you. So I do think that the almost glorification about the sickening October 7th attacks also was a really big blow and alerted people to the kinds of politics that was festering amongst many of these ideologies.
Yeah, exactly. And perhaps the common thread is that, you can't pretend anymore at the end of 2024 that, say, supporting trans rights is just about being nice to trans people. You can't pretend that supporting critical race theory or affirmative action is just about wanting equality. Those positions now stand exposed starkly for what they are and how regressive they are.
No, absolutely. And it's interesting. I don't know what you think about this, Francis, because you've obviously spent a lot of time in the US recently. But that kind of cultural vibe shift that seems to have happened as well, Joe Rogan plumping for Trump, a lot of people who were in that kind of former liberal, anti-woke space deciding to move over a lot because of these cultural issues. Do you think that's going to stick around?
I think the interesting thing, if you look at Trump, and if you take away the Republican brand, just look at the people who he's on the ticket with. Tulsi Gabbard, former Democrat candidate for president. RFK Jr., former Dem. Elon, former Dem. You're looking at it, and Trump himself, who was a former Dem at one point, and you're looking at it and you're going, well, what actually you're seeing here isn't really right wing. What this is it's something else. It's a new phenomenon. And I think what's going to be interesting moving forward is, are they going to be able to hold this broad coalition of people together? Or is it going to be too broad a church and they're going to break up once their own views come into play and also their own egos? So I think it's very interesting. Like, Joe came out in support and loads of other comics. I think Theo did as well. But the reality is, I think what they saw it as was a new dawn of politics.
And but I guess, does it broaden things out for culture? Is it possibly more? We're going to see more less woke on TV, less woke in Hollywood. I mean, there is a sense that you hear stories about certain projects now being greenlit, which is bizarre. If you think about it, it shouldn't matter who the president is in terms of what films get made or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to think that a lot, because these things, are commissioned a couple of years in advance.
Mm.
We're probably going to get still a lot of, quite woke stuff on television and so on and so forth. In a sense, though, I think the British establishment are probably like slower take up than the American one. And I think, many of us have, rightly been pointing out about the kind of importation of some elements of the explosive racial culture wars. But now we're seeing actually in America this might actually end, to some extent quicker in terms of with the, the populists in power, so to speak. I think a lot of the kind of British establishment, still the liberal and progressives, are probably a bit slower to recognise, because you can see in the disdain and shock that almost seems more so sometimes in the UK media than in the US media.
But we haven't quite got the message from the imperial centre yet.
Exactly.
Still, and when you see it, perhaps even worse in places like Ireland, Tom. These even smaller places that are still, in a way, they think they're very progressive, but perhaps they're behind the times by sticking with work.
Exactly. And Ireland's an interesting one because in terms of its sort of electoral politics, it hasn't had the kind of rupture, the kind of break that we might have thought of. But there was that referendum earlier in the year, the family and care referendum, this attempt to rewrite the Irish constitution, supposedly along more woke lines, and that was flatly rejected. It precipitated the fall of Leo Varadkar. So when given an opportunity to say, enough of this, it seems like voters across the piece are taking it, even if their political elites are slower to catch up.
A lot of people nowadays are working from home. They say it gives them a real sense of freedom, not having to get the tube or the bus every day, not having to sit at that particular desk in that stuffy office. But if you want to experience real freedom, the best way to do that is by becoming your own boss. And if that's something you've dreamed of, I can tell you, it sounds like this. Yes, that's the sound of a new sale on Shopify, the all-in-one commerce platform helping you start, run, and grow your dream business. Whether you're selling pots and pans or designer brands, Shopify simplifies selling online and in person so you can focus on what matters, your customers and your product. One of the great things about Shopify is that it's so hassle-free. It covers all of your sales channels. You've got a shop-front-ready point-of-sale system and an all-in-one e-commerce platform. It even takes care of selling across those vital social media marketplaces like Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. And Shopify has all of the latest industry-leading tools. You can keep complete control of your business, and you don't need to worry about learning new skills in areas like design or coding. And did I mention Spotify's extensive business course library? It means 24/7 help is always there. Shopify is ready to support you and your business dreams every step of the way. It's time to get serious about selling and get Shopify today. This is Possibility, powered by Shopify. Sign up now for a £1 per month trial period at shopify.co.uk/spiked. Go to shopify.co.uk/spiked to take your business to the next level today. That's shopify.co.uk/spiked. Let's talk about the riots that rocked England in the summer. One of the huge defining moments of the early weeks of the Starmer presidency, but also it seemed to reveal a lot of things and a lot of tensions that have been bubbling for many years. The elite point of view of the riots, Inaya, is basically that, we've all got a bit too much free speech, that everyone out there is horrible anyway, and we've unleashed this this nastiness that is latent within inside us. What do you make of that sort of take?
Yeah, I think that there has been a complete head in the sand engagement with what had happened. I mean, there are obviously those that think that people shouldn't have experienced the full force of the law. I think that to some extent, Starmer is right insofar as you have to end the violence and eruption and riots that are taking place. You have to go strong on it. But after that, you have to reflect on why something like this has happened. Why is there so much resentment in particular communities that it has actually exploded in ways, in racist, horrible violence that, we haven't seen for a very long time. And their answer is to censor, to try and tighten controls on speech and not engage in any of these kinds of critical questions. And I think that very much speaks to the kind of politics that Starmer propagates. He doesn't really have much politics. He's very legalistic. He's very, I think, authoritarian in many ways. And so his instincts is to just shut down these conversations. And I think that is just going to fuel further resentment.
Yeah, Tom. I mean, obviously, for no offense to our American viewers, but there has been this sense from abroad that Britain has suddenly slid into a sort of dystopia of censorship.
Yeah.
But of course, a lot of these things have been around for a while. Nevertheless, Starmer is wants to go further down the route of censorship. But what have you made of that kind of?
No, absolutely. I think what's depressing about Starmer is that his government is very naturally authoritarian, but that's completely of a piece with the way in which the British establishment has been in this country for a very long time. I think a lot of people, not just in America, but also in Britain, were maybe slightly unaware of the extent of our hate speech laws, the extent to which people can be arrested, criminalised for saying things online, deeply abhorrent things in many cases, but nevertheless, if you believe in free speech, that is something which locking someone up for that should be unconscionable. That's just part of like the operating system of our politics and our law, and it has been for a very long time. Britain, along with a lot of European countries, have bought this myth that the way in which you challenge bigotry is through censorship, and also not recognizing that actually censorship can play a role in inflaming those intolerances, those bigotries. They can certainly feed the conspiratorial form that racism now seems to take in the current moment, in the kind of online echo chambers in which it's currently developing. So yes, it was one of those things where the response to the riots was so misguided, seemed to hold free speech accountable fundamentally rather than anything else, almost rather than the individuals themselves. The issue here is that Elon Musk didn't censor enough, and if it wasn't for that, this never would have happened, seems to be the take. But Starmer, being a very unimaginative and uninteresting person, is just kind of reflecting back the kind of general legalistic authoritarian turn of our politics and state for decades now.
There was almost a sense, from the British political class that Elon Musk was responsible for the riots, or even there was the hashtag Farage riots doing the rounds. And it was one of the great tragedies is how quickly the real spark of the riots, the tragic killing of 3 young girls, was just almost forgotten and effaced, partly due to the riots themselves, but partly due to the political class's, unwillingness to talk about these issues. Francis, what do you make of that?
Well, what they did very, very quickly was to shut down the riots, which is obviously what they should have done. But also it seemed to be like anybody who was sharing a meme or people who were making comments, however unpleasant, were then, had the police turning up at their door, put in front of a court. Some of them were put in jail. And it got to the point where it was bizarrely surreal, where they were releasing people from jail in order to put people who said nasty things online, including one person who was a registered sex offender who got as far as a train station before he sexually assaulted someone and then had to be put back in prison. So as we were all looking at this, thinking there is something really awry going on here. And what made me think what really, really worried me is, if you look back at April the 1st, where the Scottish government, they effectively criminalised public performance.
With the hate speech
law.
The
hate speech. So it's not just in this country, it's also happening in Scotland. And what we're also getting now is Labour MPs openly discussing in Parliament about blasphemy laws. And much to the, it seems to be to the enjoyment of Keir Starmer. So you're looking around, and it's not just the riots, it's also what's happening in Scotland. It's also at blasphemy laws, and it looks like they're going to be implemented soon.
Just quickly on the point about the censorship and, at the same time, being obfuscating about the facts of the situation.
Yes, I did want to ask you about that. We shouldn't deny that, the word racism is thrown around a lot willy-nilly, but these were racist riots.
Absolutely. And, because the police and other services, failed to provide information when people clearly, were seeing the horrific thing that took place and wanted to get information, they allowed this kind of vacuum to be created, which was filled with, on people's prejudices of all different things. As we remember, people said it was a asylum seeker called Ali al-Shakati. And
Ali the apartment, I think.
That's what in Arabic. So people were obviously just trying to think about what rang true to them based off of other things that have happened. And so there was censorship on the one hand, and then just not telling people what was going on the other hand. which created this horrible vacuum. And I think that, again, we're seeing a similar thing now, because there's a lot of these kind of laws about reporting on what's happening with this trial. There's like various different groups of people trying to fill in those blanks. And I think we need frank honesty about what's going on and the problems within society. And that would actually relieve this pressure cooker that we're building.
It's a good thing we got Keir Starmer in charge.
He'll sort it out.
A leader for our times.
Yeah.
Before we move on, I did want to ask you, though, a little bit about the kind of the apologism for the rioting, the apologism for some of the violence. You know, we should remind ourselves that people did try to set fire to an asylum centre. People were in Southport, you know, the town where the attack happened, throwing things and barricading people into a mosque. This was very serious racist violence, but a lot of people were trying to downplay that, not fully confront that, you know, as if there's something progressive about that.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I don't live in that area, but even as an ethnic minority, you know, I was worried when I was seeing that. You know, this is not something that, you know, we're used to seeing in this country. There were reports that random non-white people were being assaulted. You know, this is really dark, horrible stuff. And I think that there was a lot of conflation going on, that certain commentators and activists, I think, on the right were trying to essentially just lump racist violence by often, you know, serial criminals and other people as just part of a kind of general backlash against all sorts of different issues within society. And no doubt there are real issues we need to talk about, you know, the establishment ignoring about people's concerns about migration, other cultural practices that we don't talk about that are really harmful, but lumping that all in to racist violence, I actually just think often alienates majority people that want absolutely nothing to do with that kind of stuff, and actually just makes it easier for people that want to shut down that discussion to say, oh, actually, well, you're just as bad as all of these kinds of people.
And they're buying into the kind of the people who should know better, basically on the right, were buying in almost to the Guardian Easter caricature that people who are concerned about immigration are basically a pogrom in waiting. And by there would be all kinds of different ways people would do it, but by either refusing to acknowledge it or by kind of looking past it or trying to present in a roundabout kind of way this as an not just explicable but inevitable, perhaps even understandable response to mass immigration or so on. They just conflated the mass of society with racist, violent thugs. It was precisely what they were accusing Keir Starmer of doing in his speeches and his responses to all of it. But I think you made this point in your end of year piece, Inaya. There's a very similar dynamic to, in the same way that a lot of people who should have known better on the left when wokeness started to arise didn't really want to admit that this was a problem because it would be ammunition, because it would be something which could be weaponized against the left, etc. I think there's a similar dynamic where there's people on the conservative end of politics who, either because they're just desperate for those retweets or either because they're worried that it's somehow going to be weaponized against their own side, are refusing to acknowledge the racism that was staring them in the faces during those horrendous couple of weeks.
I think it just shows the power of groupthink, and it also just shows the power of tribes, in that nobody wants to be actually potentially alienate their tribe by saying what is actually true. I remember we interviewed Peter Blexley, a former police officer, and we were talking about the riots, and I was, you know, I remembered speaking at one point and talking about how there were racist elements to it. I saw a clip of, I think it was 6 white guys beating up a black guy. And it just reminded me of the worst of far-right racism, particularly related to football violence in the 1980s. Yeah. And the fact that I didn't see practically anybody on the right come out and condemn it. Maybe they did, but I didn't really see any of them. Is frankly abhorrent. Yeah.
Well, let's zoom out from the UK and talk a bit about the Middle East and the sort of unravelling or maybe the remaking of the world order, because we began, you know, this time last year we were lamenting the pogrom of October 7th. Things have shifted considerably since then. You know, we see actually Israel winning the war against its enemies, against its Hamas, Hezbollah, or the other Iranian-backed stooges. Tom, do you want to talk a little bit about what's been going on there?
No, it has been really quite stunning. And it not only, I suppose, has been important for Israel and its security, but also seems to be reshaping the politics of the region in interesting ways. The fact that not only have they been able to degrade Hamas to a pretty significant degree, but also that the decapitation of the Hezbollah leadership was so significant, so broad sweeping. I mean, it's often, we kind of think about it as the kind of top commanders, but the kind of whole kind of middle kind of ranks of people who were, again, kind of executing Hezbollah actions on a day-to-day basis through that pager stunt, through all these different things. They've just been so significantly pared back. And that obviously is one of the things that was so significant in sparking the unravelling of the Assad regime, and also the increasing kind of unravelling of Iranian imperial sort of activities in that part of the world. So that's been really striking. What has also, of course, been striking is as these victories against Islamist barbarism in various different forms are being chalked up by Israel as it defends itself, there's also been this faltering Western support. I mean, we have a government currently in the UK which nominally supports Israel and its right to defend itself, but has openly said that it would arrest its prime minister if he ever touched down in the country because of the International Criminal Court arrest warrants which had been issued. So it's a stark contrast, I think, in terms of what has been going on the ground in Israel, and what the way in which it's made almost the Western political class nervous rather than soming which is seen as a potentially positive development.
I think the situation is very interesting, particularly when you look at just how anti-Semitism seems to have been normalised now. I remember thinking 3 or 4 years ago that this anti-Semitism wasn't something that you ever saw. It wasn't something that, you'd get the occasional idiot on Twitter or on social media, but that was pretty much it. And then post-October 7th, you've just seen it just explode to the point where people who you thought were sane and rational are now just emboldened to say things that are openly anti-Semitic. And that's the thing that I found really worrying about this. I mean, look, there's lots of things, but it's just now that you can openly say that you have a hatred of Jewish people and Jews, and that's now seems to be fine.
Yeah. Or as usually you try and hide it by saying you're criticizing Israel, but often, the real message is clear a lot of the time. Inaya.
Yeah, I think I would echo actually very much what Francis said, and I've been having these conversations with a lot of people that the over anti-Semitism that you see now, oftentimes it's dressed up as people would use the word Zionist or Zionism when they're clearly just talking about Jewish people. I mean, some of the incidents that you see, I think just quite recently, someone was shouting anti-Semitic things to Jewish children like outside of a school, and there was barely a societal response. If this was any other group, there would be complete outrage, rightly so, that we would think, how have we got to this point as a society? We need to do something about this. But if Jewish people experience this kinds of abuse, it is just viewed as fine. And we saw what was happening on a lot of American campuses. A lot of the things that were being said by many of those students, the sheer hypocrisy of a lot of those university establishments. I remember that there was the famous questioning where could you say that very overtly anti-Semitic things.
I was in Congress where there were various university presidents were asked, is it okay to advocate for genocide on campus?
And it was all about context all of a sudden when all of the conversations we've been having about free speech for years, they were completely morally absolute.
You can't say that, women don't have penises, but you can say
exactly.
Let's genocide the Jewish race.
And that we just saw that absolute hypocrisy across the board. And as Thomas said, the cowardice that we have seen in the equivocation amongst our political elites has been really quite striking. I mean, and many of them, it's really just what's politically expedient. They are facing challenges in many of their seats. I mean, Wes Streeting nearly lost his seat to a Gaza independent. And that kind of constituency is increasingly prominent in the discourse. And the political elites lack the moral courage and clarity to take a clear stance at fear of alienating certain people.
And it seems that many of the, even in relation to the Middle East specifically, many of the fears that people might have had, some more justifiable than others, that the actions Israel has taken would lead to something truly terrible, to all-out war with Iran or whatever. That hasn't happened either. In fact, we've seen the weakening not only of, as you were saying, Tom, not only of Iran but also Syria, one of its key or Syria being a key proxy of Iran, if that makes sense.
Of course, it would be wise not to make too many prognostications about
Of
what's
course.
going to happen in the Middle East, but it has been really interesting. And of course, the Syrian piece of this is so striking, the speed with which that regime collapsed, and also the speed with which Western policymakers suddenly were quite happy to say, in the form of HTS and Abu Mohammed al-Jilani, maybe this is an Islamist we can do business with, and potentially repeating the mistakes of many, many years before. Whilst that is obviously, you can see in terms of the outpouring of joy on the streets of Syria in response to the toppling of a deeply cruel, malicious, sadistic dictatorship that's still sort of fraught with peril as to where that particular country and where the region is now headed in the years ahead. So yeah, all these things are. You just wish we had a kind of political leadership, like David Lammy is our foreign secretary, as all of these things are going on. It does keep you up at night.
Yeah, not a man made for these dangerous and interesting times.
I mean, the situation in Syria is very interesting. I think one thing that people don't talk enough about actually is the fact that it helped to be propped up. It was propped up effectively by Russia.
Yes.
And Russia couldn't do as much as they used to be able to because of the invasion of Ukraine. So I think one of the things, you shouldn't make predictions, number one, but number two is you never realize that when one thing happens, it can have all these unforeseen consequences 1, 2, or even 3 years down the line.
Yeah.
So at the moment, none of us knows what's going to happen with the situation in Syria, what the impact is going to be on Iran, Israel, or on the Middle East as a whole.
Yeah.
It is just interesting, because as we're talking about, predictions and things, Donald Trump's presidency will be a very different era when it comes to foreign policy. I mean, when the Syrian regime was toppled, I think he tweeted, I don't want to, they don't like us anyway, either side, we don't want to get involved, and that's obviously a bit of a departure from what Americans are usually doing. I mean, obviously
Starmer said let's get involved more.
Yeah, exactly.
Playing
and the Trump administration is there's different moods in terms of Ukraine. They're a bit, some of them are more skeptical than others. Many of them are much more interested in what's going on in Taiwan and China. So I think that this new era of Trump will be a very different foreign policy engagement to what we've seen.
Yeah, and Tom, finally, I mean, it does. A lot of people were saying, as it looks as if the war in Ukraine might possibly be winding down. We don't know. There's talk of a potential peace agreement. They have to agree to it, of course. A lot of people will now be saying, well, what was the point of all that? Why did we back Ukraine for so long? Why did we allow the war to drag on? Isn't it all NATO's war anyway? What do you make of that kind of?
I think it's just worth remembering that, and worth pushing back on this very simplistic narrative that's spun about Ukraine, that the only reason they resisted the invasion of their country was because Joe Biden told them to, essentially, because Boris Johnson was dispatched to tell them not to make peace. All of these bizarre sort of theories which have curdled on sections of the supposedly anti-war, but it's basically become sort of anti-Ukraine sections of social media, are such nonsense. And also the idea that it was all for nothing. I mean, if you think about the position that Ukraine could have been in if they didn't fight back and weren't given support to do so, if that column of tanks running towards Kiev had been more successful, if there wasn't the liberation of Kherson and the Kharkiv offensive, which freed up so much land, which had previously been captured by the invaders, a lot of this has obviously put them in whilst it does seem like we're heading towards a kind of deeply unsatisfying, for all concerned, basically, sort of peace, and a very shaky one, no doubt, if that's what actually is finally achieved. The idea that it was all for nothing, or they haven't put themselves in a much better position because they had that brave fight back and that brave defense of their country, I think is for the birds, really. And it's this idea that they were only doing it, that it's this kind of phony divided country that was only standing up for themselves because they were being manipulated by their own oligarchs and pumped with American money, is obviously ridiculous if you talk to anyone from that country.
Right, I want to finally end on something a bit more lighthearted, and let's discuss our highlights or possible lowlights of the year. Tom, what have you picked as your highlight of 2024?
I've got two Wales-related things. Am I
Two
allowed
Wales, two. You can have two.
Wales
Well, if they're both connected.
So number one is Donald Trump on the Joe Rogan Experience talking about how he wants to be a whale psychologist.
Yeah.
You know what it is? I want to be a whale psychiatrist. It drives the whales freaking crazy.
Yes, incredible. Just apropos enough, I'm not into this. The other thing is, I don't know if anyone else has been, this kind of a story from this year, but also the last few years. Since 2020, like the Welsh government have been going slowly more and more insane. They signed themselves up to this anti-racist action plan. And so there is this constant steady stream of stories, particularly in the Telegraph, of like all of the bizarre initiatives they've had to embark upon because of this, like a list of various racist buildings because the pub was named after Nelson or what have you.
Or pirates.
There's a
and things like that.
dog-free walking zone because apparently that was, more inclusive for minorities.
Dogs are racist.
Yeah.
Dogs are racist, yeah.
There was something about the librarians having to do their anti-racist training, but they couldn't do it in the racist buildings, and also so
there was a whole town that was condemned as racist, or a whole village.
Yeah,
because it's called Nelson.
Exactly.
And Nelson is a symbol of racism. So you can't do any government work in this village of Nelson because you might be contaminated by the Welsh racism virus.
It's a hell of a rabbit hole to go down. So yes, whale psychologist and racist whales is my two things.
I'm going to say mine because it's slightly related. Another sort of province of the UK, Scotland, Humza Yousaf. You mentioned earlier, Francis, the Hate Crime Act. 2024 was the year it came into force. And it was absolutely glorious that about a week after it came in, we discovered that the most complained about hate criminal to the police was none other than Humza Yousaf himself, with people reporting this insane speech that he gave to the Scottish Parliament where he denounced all of the leading figures of the Scottish establishment as white.
The Lord President, white. The Lord Justice Clerk, white. Every High Court judge, white.
I don't believe in hate speech, but it was a pretty hateful, pretty angry speech. Inaya, what's your?
I've got loads.
Okay.
Joe, you just reminded me of one. I didn't actually think about it before, but that I think Islamists who tried to buy like a Scottish island. And then actually, and then in reaction, the Conservative commentator Calvin Robinson went on tried to have a GoFundMe to create a Christian alternative to the island. But I think loads of them came out of the US. The famous Kamala Harris, unburdened by what has been.
Yeah. What can be unburdened by what has been.
It just showed again just this kind of Meghan Markle-esque, quite vacuous type of politics that really just summed it up for a lot of people.
That's why we're here today. Because we have the ability to see what can be, unburdened by what has been.
We can see what is possible, unburdened by what has been.
Joe Biden introducing Vladimir Zelensky as Vladimir Putin.
And now I want to hand it over to the president of Ukraine, who has as much courage as he has determination. Ladies and gentlemen, President Putin.
We're all meant to just believe that this guy is just like a folksy everyman. There's nothing wrong going on here. That making such a gaffe.
It was amazing because that was after the debate where he unraveled live on air, and everyone bigged this up. This was going to be Joe Biden's chance to prove that actually he's fine and actually there's nothing wrong, and that he just had one bad day, and then he not only introduced Zelensky as Vladimir Putin, he also described Mr. Putin as very brave and courageous and determined.
And then he corrected himself like, no, I mean, we're going to get Putin. We don't like Putin. Anyway, here's Putin. Absolutely amazing. I'm going to miss him.
He will be missed.
I think my moment was the Tony Hinchcliffe joke saga.
There's literally a floating island of garbage in the middle of the ocean right now. Yeah. I think it's called Puerto Rico.
So I went to the rally to see for myself. And
wow.
Yeah, and then I saw, number one, like, it was just so mental watching Hulk Hogan deliver a speech on stage at the rally. And I was there going, I can't see this happening in the Conservative Party conference.
Really going to dig out my giant haystacks.
And today, this is Donald Trump's house, brother.
And then it all unfolded, and and AOC was very skilled the way she manipulated it and made it into this huge story. And then Biden came out and then described all the people at the rally as garbage.
The only garbage I see floating out there is his supporters.
Yes.
then therefore killing the story. And then Trump came out in the reflective garbage man outfit. And you're going, oh, what is going on here? Is this politics? Is this a roast? It was just insane just to be in the epicenter of that and just watch it all unfold.
I mean, it's saying something that 3/4 of people's highlights were Trump related, but that's fine. That's fine.
Of course.
I mean,
The banter era returns, so that's the main
Banter
thing, you know.
returns, exactly.
He's the funniest guy on planet Earth.
Yeah. Well, it's going to be a very exciting 2025. Thank you so much for watching the Spiked podcast. We'll be back next Friday. If you hit subscribe and click the bell, you'll never miss an episode. And in the meantime, why not check out all of Spiked's other videos and podcasts on this channel? And for more Spiked content, find us at spiked-online.com.